Whitney, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse.
Maybe I can. What's your offer?
Would you like some Skittles?
I can refuse that. But I'm not going to. I like the green ones best.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Critically Acclaimed, the podcast where highbrow and lowbrow collide?
It's too many explosions.
It's the most explosive episode of Critically Acclaimed yet, because we got a big one this week.
Well, we have a popular one.
I think it's a big deal. My name is William Bibbiani. I'm a film critic for the internet. Everybody calls me Bibbs.
My name is Witney Seibold. I'm also a film critic, and I'm the cynical one.
Oh, this is going to be fun. We need to talk to you about superhero movies.
Superhero movies are the best.
You're the snobbiest snob who ever snobbed.
Hey, you know what? I'm following Alonso Duralde's lead here, and I'm trying to take snob back. Mm-hmm. You know, he pointed out that, you know, a lot has been done to take nerd back. Nerd is no longer an insult. Now it's simply a descriptor. And he said that having refined taste and being discerning should not be looked down upon. So snob perhaps should be taken back on.
Fair enough. I don't disagree with that. I think it's possible to be a jerk about it, but it's also possible to be a jerk about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So
well, it's possible to be a jerk about a nerd, or just about anything. You can be a jerk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just don't be a jerk about it. You can be a snob without being a jerk.
You know what? Mm-hmm. Fine. But in any case, we have a lot to cover on this week's Critically Acclaimed. It is the last episode of the month, and as you well know, the last episode of the month, and every month of Critically Acclaimed, we review an entire motion picture franchise. And for the month of April, we're only doing really classy stuff.
Well, rather, you're picking the really classy stuff.
Yeah, and we gave you a whole bunch of really classy franchises to choose from, and you chose the Godfather movies. Mm-hmm. Often acclaimed as some of the best motion pictures ever made. We're going to have a long talk about that. And on top of that, we have a couple of new releases. There's a new Adam Sandler movie on Netflix.
It's called The Week Of.
Ooh.
And I watched it.
I'm sorry. I read your review.
You go where the job takes you.
And also there's a new Marvel movie called Avengers Infinity War, which is kind of a thing. And because it is such a thing, and because people keep saying they don't want anyone to talk anything about it, we're going to actually mix up the podcast. Usually we do our new movie reviews first, and then lead into our sort of retrospective reviews, be they the double feature or the whole franchise. Because we know some of you don't want to hear anyone talk about an Infinity War in any way yet, because not everyone's had a chance to get to the theater, we're going to save the new reviews, and in particular the Infinity War review, for last. So we're going to start with the Godfather movies, then we're going to review The Week Of, then we're going to review Avengers Infinity War in a non-spoilery way, but then, and we'll give you a lot of warning for this, we will talk about some spoilers, because I think there are things that we can say, both positive and negative, about this movie that we really can't get into without describing what actually happens in it in a meaningful way.
In the end, yeah.
And even, honestly, just some of the bigger plot points in the middle.
Yeah.
I think some things are really awesome, and I think some things are worth sort of raising an eyebrow about, but I really can't describe that to you without going into some detail about the plot. But again, we will give you a countdown, we will give you a warning, and that will be the last thing on the podcast. So if you don't want to listen to that, you can still listen to all the other stuff and not have to surf around and hope you don't accidentally hear a spoiler.
We're not going to slip. We're not going to slip up.
No.
I'll say this right now, though. Thanos is a sled.
That's a reference to another movie. He's not actually a sled. If in case anyone's just like, oh my god, what's a sled? Is a sled like some sort of acronym, like SHIELD?
Sorry. Thanos was a sled in the usual crying game. So I'm just mixing everything up today. But let's get started with the Godfather Trilogy, which are, as you said, some of the best films of all time.
And they're certainly acclaimed as such.
There were 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Hence the word trilogy. The first one came out in 1972, 2 years, and it won Best Picture and a bunch of other Academy Awards.
It only won 3 Academy Awards.
Oh, really?
Isn't that weird?
I thought it won 9 or something.
No. That was the same year. The Godfather came out the same year Cabaret came out. And Cabaret is the film that has won the most Academy Awards without winning Best Picture.
Right.
Cabaret won 10 Academy Awards.
And Cabaret is darn good. I love Cabaret.
Cabaret is great. It was a really good year. But yeah, it only won the Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Actor for Marlon Brando, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo, who wrote the original novel as well. Didn't win Best Director even. So we think of it as this big Oscar-y movie. It kind of just slipped in there, like Spotlight. It was not winning a bunch of stuff.
Nothing, but it's the best picture.
Yeah, exactly.
2 years later, in 1974, in 1973, The Sting won Best Picture. In 1974,
that's
however,
a good movie.
It's not as well regarded as The Godfather, is my point.
But it's a good movie. I'm not going to have any The Sting naysaying.
I know
it's fine.
There are Sting naysayers in the world.
But that's only because it got built up so much because it's a Best Picture winner. That's a very well-made con artist movie.
Okay. If you say so.
I do. I like that movie.
1974, Godfather Part II came out, and that also won Best Picture. And it's still, to date, the only sequel, apart from The Return of the King, to have done so.
So it's not the only sequel. There are only 2 sequels that have done that.
There's some argument, I've heard some people say that Return of the King doesn't count as a sequel because they were all produced as, like, one production. That's splitting hairs, though.
I think that's splitting hairs, yeah. But yeah.
It was the only one to do it until Return of the King.
And then in 1990, 16 years later, they reunited to conclude the trilogy with The Godfather Part III, which was nominated for a bunch of Oscars and won nothing. For reasons we will explain. But let's get started with The Godfather Part I. The Godfather was a novel. It was a best-selling novel written by Mario Puzo, and it was about the Corleone family, or the Corleone family, depending on who is actually pronouncing it.
Well, it depends on what country they're in.
Exactly.
In America, they say Corleone. When they finally go to Sicily, they say Corleone.
Yeah. It is about... it is a sort of a... It's the history of the mafia in America, but there's a whole bunch of, like... They fictionalized it. So instead of having Bugsy Siegel, the gangster who helped found Las Vegas, they have a character named Mo Green.
Yeah.
Instead of Meyer Lansky, who was basically the bookie for the accountant for all of the major mafiosos, and who was one of the only ones that actually like lived to old age. They have who's the name of the guy in the second one? The Godfather Part II.
Yeah, the guy.
This is gonna drive me up the wall.
I forgot the character's
Hyman
name.
Roth, played by the great Lee Strasberg, one of the most influential acting teachers in history.
Schools named after him.
Yeah. So what we have here is we have sort of a parallel American history. And it is specifically the history of an immigrant experience. This is about people moving to America, in particular from Sicily, and finding their fortune in a very capitalist way, but doing so outside the law and building up their own sort of Roman empire. And within that empire, there are tales of epic tragedy, of love and loss, and death, and murder and war. And it really does contribute to this sort of fantasy, not just of the mafia, but of America as this land of legend, where everything is very plausible the way that Francis Ford Coppola presents it, at least until the third one. But it has this air of hugeness to it. It really does feel like a Greek tragedy in a lot of ways.
The length and the span of time and the connection to history all has that. And I wouldn't call it Greek, I'd call it Shakespearean in sort of its treatment of these incredibly broad, poetic characters. The main character, the title character, the Godfather, is Vito Corleone.
The name The Godfather transitions.
But at the outset of the film, and all of the scenes with Vito Corleone, as you know, the first Godfather opens, he's at his daughter's wedding, he's granting favors. His empire has been ensconced in America for a long, long time.
Yeah, a couple of decades at that point.
Yeah. And he is already a figure of menace and fear and power and benevolence. He is sort of this godhead of all of these crime families.
Depending on your relationship to him, he's either a loving member of the family or a terrifying threat to your well-being.
Yeah. And credit to Marlon Brando. He won that Oscar. He communicates every bit of that by not moving at all. Like, he is able to just sort of sit and give a brief pause before speaking, letting you know that you're just totally screwed.
The amazing thing about Marlon Brando in this particular movie, because we've seen many different performances from Marlon Brando. We've seen very wild, unhinged performances from Marlon Brando. And this was at a time in Marlon Brando's career when he was not a big star. Like, his star had fallen. People would were not interested.
Decades after the Wild One.
Yeah, and this actually helped transform his career and give his career like an entirely new lease on life. And what we see in The Godfather is a character who has so much power, so much authority, and so much experience that he doesn't need to prove shit.
Yeah.
And there's something about that is deeply magnetic.
Well, it's magnetic, and it seems to be the opposite of what we go for today. When you watch a lot of movies today, like if they were to make another Godfather movie in 2018, well, I guess we already had sort of an origin story of Vito Corleone, but that's kind of the approach I think they would go for. They'd show how he came to be. It would be more about the mechanics of him becoming strong and actually watching him be menacing and hurt people rather than just simply already having it. Think of something like Darth Vader. You see him in the first Star Wars. He doesn't kick a lot of ass, but he's terrifying.
He's fully formed.
And, fast forward to Rogue One, well, they have to have that scene where he just sort of rips people apart in a hallway just because
just look at
we need to see him be a badass.
Well, just look at the prequels and just how we need to see him from childhood. We don't necessarily, granted, we get, you're right, the backstory of Vito Corleone in the second one. But in the first, The Godfather, that's who he is. He's the father. He's not just the father of this family. He's the father of organized crime as we see it. And we see every facet of that. And one of the things that I think is most remarkable about the Godfather movies, or at least the first two, we'll get to the Godfather Part III. But one of the things that's really remarkable about it is that there's this huge scope, there's this huge sweep to the narrative. And again, it involves murder and mayhem and drugs and gambling and blackmail and
not drugs at first, if you recall.
No, not at all.
I love the line of dialogue. Well, I hear there's a lot of money in that white powder. Like they don't even know what drugs are. Just that maybe it's a crime thing we could do.
They actually have no interest at first. What Francis Ford Coppola does, and it's very notable that at the beginning of The Godfather, when you think about how we're going to start this crime saga, you think to yourself, we're going to start with a murder, or we're going to start with a heist, or
Tommy guns sticking out of a Duesenberg.
He starts with a wedding. He starts with the Godfather's daughter's wedding.
And that takes a huge chunk of... That's like the first act of the movie.
Yeah, it's a long time. We see that entire wedding for like a while. And so while we keep cutting back from people dancing and drinking and singing and having a wonderful time, we keep cutting back to in the garden house somewhere. Vito Corleone, there's a tradition that we are told that no man can refuse a favor on the day of his daughter's wedding, so people are coming to him for favors. One person comes to him and says, "These people assaulted my daughter, I want you to kill them." And Godfather just says, "Well, I'm not going to kill them. They didn't kill your daughter, but I will mess them up for you."
Yeah.
And another guy is like, "Well, this boy works in my shop. They want to deport him." Godfather's just like, "I know judges. I'll make that go away." A guy who is a very obvious analog for Frank Sinatra. A crooner.
He's kind of like Sinatra meets Robert Evans.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. He comes in and just says, "Godfather, help me start my career. I'm a crooner now. But what I want is this acting gig in this war movie based on a best-selling novel called From Schmear to Schmaternity." And they won't give me the role, and the Godfather slaps around and says, "Be a man. Come on, I'll figure this out." And he sends someone out there to Hollywood
to rough up the producer. They send Robert Duvall.
They send Robert Duvall to rough up the producer. We're going to talk about the whole cast in a second.
He doesn't really rough him up, just to sort of lean. It's like, those are nice stables. Be a pity if something happened to them sort of language.
Well, because what happens is Robert Duvall goes to Hollywood. He goes to the producer and just says, "Hey, this guy wants this role. We could do a favor for you. We know you have some union problems out here. We know a lot about that business." And the guy says no. And what it ends up being is the producer basically starts peacocking, and he starts like waving his feathers around and just says, "No, I'm in charge here." And that crooner got one of my young starlets pregnant, and I was in love with her, and I'll never give him that role, no matter what. And so after a long scene in which he pointedly points out his favorite possession, his show pony that he's going to take out the stud. This won't be important later, will it? He wakes up, and in one of the most famous scenes in movie history, he wakes up with a horse head in his bed.
Yeah, it's covered in blood.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying because horses are just terrifying creatures. It's
You're
like
the
this
only
weird
one who thinks that.
this weird angular monster head in his bed, and he's covered with blood. You think he's bleeding at first.
You're the only one who thinks horses are that. Okay, I'm sure there are others, but that's not the most common takeaway from horses.
I suppose not. But if I were to whip back a blanket and there's a human head in my bed, I'd be terrified.
I would hope so.
If it was a horse's,
that was Tuesday for you.
If it was a horse's head, however, I think I'd be one measurable fear point higher.
You would be more concerned about a horse head in your bed than a human head.
I wouldn't be concerned. I'd just be scared. Because one is a human and one is a monster. But call me strange.
I'm going to call you very strange. That's an odd takeaway.
Also, what did they do with the rest of that horse?
It's a good question.
Did they bury it? Is it still in the stable?
Probably still in the stable.
How'd they get the head off? That would have taken a long time.
Well, they had time.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
They had a chainsaw.
We need to talk about the cast of The Godfather because it is sprawling and huge and amazing. So in addition to Marlon Brando, as we've already mentioned, we have the rest of the Corleone family. We have Sonny, played by the great James Caan. We have...
Star of Mickey Blue Eyes.
Yes! It's a joke for all of our Cancel Too Soon fans. It's true, he's in it, but there's a reference.
He plays the gangster in Mickey Blue Eyes.
He most certainly does. We have Michael, played by Al Pacino, a young Al Pacino who was not a big star yet. This made him in a lot of ways. He was in like Panic in Needle Park.
He was in Needle Park. He
wasn't big.
He was a growing quantity.
Yeah.
This is sort of what really smacked him on the map, though.
We have the older brother, Fredo, played by the incredible John Cazale,
who was in 5 movies, they're all great.
They're all great, and they were all Best Picture nominees or winners. John Cazale was only in his entire acting career, and he only had major roles in all these movies. He was in The Godfather.
The Godfather Part II.
Dog Day Afternoon. You can do it.
Oh, golly.
The Conversation.
That's right, he was in The Conversation.
And The Deer Hunter. Yeah. Those are 3 Best Picture winners and 2 Best Picture nominees, and they're all incredible.
When The Deer Hunter is like the low end of your filmography, you're in good shape.
Yeah, he left us way too soon.
There's a great documentary about him called I Knew It Was You.
Oh, that's a good title. Rounding out the cast, we have sort of the Corleone family's adopted, unofficially son, Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall. He's the consigliere, which is basically the lawyer.
It's almost like the gopher.
Counselor. Yeah, he does. He's the Merlin to King Arthur, if you will. And the other prominent roles we have in the first film in particular are Talia Shire as Costanza Connie Corleone, the sister in the family, and Diane Keaton as Kay, who is in love with Michael at the beginning. And at the beginning of the movie, we see that at this wedding, while everyone is going around doing their wedding business and doing their mafia business, Michael is actually a war hero. He's just back from World War II, still wearing his uniform. He is with Kay, and we realize that he has been kept at a distance from the family business.
Well, he seems to have kept himself at a distance, and he describes very cynically who all of these people are to Kay, who's clearly an outsider. It's like, hey, see that guy? Yeah, he's murdered like 20 people. And that guy, he's murdered 15. That guy's murdered 20. It's like, he has no interest in what his family does.
But it doesn't faze him either. Like, he loves them and he knows.
He grew up with it. He knows what it is. And, he respects his family, I think, even if he doesn't necessarily like his family. I don't think he likes either his brothers, especially not Sonny.
Maybe not. I think he clearly loves his father.
And in fact, this whole first opening act, where we see the wedding and we see the Godfather, it's so striking that it just has sort of echoed throughout Hollywood. I mentioned Mickey Blue Eyes not just as a flip joke, but because, 27 years after The Godfather, James Caan is essentially playing the same role again.
Well, The Godfather...
Or the same type of gangster role.
Before
The Godfather codified in the mind of Hollywood how gangsters look and behave. It's the same way Bela Lugosi codified the way vampires behave. We know the way vampires act because we saw Bela Lugosi do it, and he did it right.
Yeah, exactly. Or Frankenstein. There are a lot of people have played Frankenstein over the years. Boris Karloff is the only one anyone thinks of. And when we think of the Mafia, we think of The Godfather, or we think of things that came out kind of parallel to The Godfather, like Goodfellas. Which was later on, came out in 1990, but like Martin Scorsese was growing up in those same neighborhoods, and he was telling similar stories in the 1970s. You look at Mean Streets, which came out around the same time as the original Godfather. It's great.
Mean Streets is really terrific.
Movie. Yeah, it's underrated. People talk about Goodfellas more. Mean Streets is like the young, angry teen version of Goodfellas.
It's like a sloppier Goodfellas.
And in fact, when Coppola had such a rough time making The Godfather, that the story goes, he actually tried to get Martin Scorsese hired to do the sequel. Which would have been interesting. It probably still would have been a really good movie, but anyway.
It would have been quite different.
Probably would have been very, very different.
Far more restrained, or less restrained.
I don't know. I think the Godfather movies are very much codified between the sort of you are there sort of realism and then huge operatic moments. I think that's kind of the...
It's certainly true of the third one.
Yeah.
In the case of the third one, quite literally.
But what he does here is he pulls back the veil of all of these big, giant moments and artifice so that you would see on the news that a gangster got killed in some sort of crazy shooting, and that seems like, such a big deal. That seems like the whole story, but then you realize the story was... And also, his sister had an abusive husband, and he was fighting that guy, and he was trying to keep his brother out of the business, and then that thing happened.
Yeah.
So, this incredible sort of aesthetic that Francis Ford Coppola creates over the course of this movie is one of absolute intimacy and naturalism and giant bullet-riddled violence.
Yeah, I was about to say that it gets torn through by sudden, hugely, shockingly violent acts. This was sort of the glory time of the squib, thanks to Sam Peckinpah. Sam Peckinpah was notoriously the first filmmaker to really fetishize bloody bullet wounds in some of his more violent westerns.
On the off chance you don't know what a squib is that sort of little mini...
miniature explosive they put under clothes to fake a bullet wound.
Yeah. So someone on set pulls a trigger on a fake gun, and then your little... pop comes out on your chest, and there's a little bit of fake blood. Different filmmakers do that in different ways. Paul Verhoeven, I think, is the master of the squib because it's like grenades go off in your chest. It's just huge.
And he can somehow fit 8 gallons of blood in any single squib. I don't know how he does it.
It's incredible.
But because violence was sort of on the uptick in the 1970s, it was particularly shocking at the time. People didn't just sort of clutch their bellies and fall over. You got to see flesh explode out of them.
Yeah.
You got to see their eyeballs roll into the back of their heads when they were garroted.
And we were out, finally, officially, out of the production code era of Hollywood filmmaking. Shortly after the invention of sound, synchronized sound, in the film industry,
the Hays Code.
The Hays Code was implemented, and it was implemented to prevent the government from censoring Hollywood. So Hollywood censored themselves, and they did so for many decades, and there were very oppressive rules of conduct that every film had to follow.
Very, very specific ones, too, about sexuality and violence.
Yeah, no kiss could last more than 3 seconds, and they cannot be open-mouthed. No wrongdoing can go unpunished by the end of the movie in some way. These are very restrictive storytelling requirements.
Yeah.
So in the 70s, when we started having the ratings system and we had more freedom, a lot of filmmakers started going mad with power. Like, oh my God, we can do anything now. And that led to a flurry of creativity. It also led to a flurry of just pure exploitative violence, some of which is better than others.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is both.
There you go. You can have both. And I think The Godfather is one of those as well, where it is extremely gory, bloody, violent, but it is also a story in which evil is not necessarily punished either. It's a very cynical story, and it's a story that could really only be told in Hollywood on this scale for the first time and around the early 70s.
Although, because this took place in the 70s, this was made in the 70s, doesn't take place in the 70s,
no.
There's also a kind of moral emptiness a nihilism and a tragedy to that nihilism that the entire series kind of revolves around. I mentioned that all of this stuff about sort of the way the gangsters live in their world has bled into Hollywood, and watching The Godfather again this time, it was actually kind of difficult for me to divorce The Godfather from its many
knockoffs.
Yeah, imitators. That world has been imitated so often that it seems contrived now. Even though this is where it came from, it's kind of hard to see that this is where it came from. And you really have to concentrate to remind yourself that this is the origin of that.
Well, I think
as a result, watching Vito and his gangster brood makes me see them as lesser beings.
Interesting.
I didn't like. He's imposing. He's threatening. You can understand what he's doing. I also see how pathetic his machismo is. And in fact, the whole world is constructed around this really kind of whiny version of violent machismo that even like the characters from Fight Club are picking up on. They don't mention Vito Corleone by name, but you can tell he's one of like sort of the figures that educated that generation of men on how to behave like a man.
Yeah, and then they didn't pay attention to the sequels and what happened to Michael afterwards.
Well, in The Godfather, what happened to Michael? Because when partway through the movie, Vito is gunned down in the street by a rival, and he is infirm, and all of a sudden his quote business, his crime empire is kind of open for looting by people within and from without of his own family. And Michael is the only one who's smart enough to go in and protect his father because he has sort of an affection for his father as a human and not necessarily as a businessman.
Right. Well,
and he starts slipping in and trying to figure out what this crime business is all about. He tries to get revenge on his father. For his father.
Yeah.
And he essentially is testing out if this is something he's capable of. And it turns out that he's not only capable of it, but he's actually quite good at it.
Well, that's the thing.
And that's the central tragedy of The Godfather. When it finally becomes about Michael and we get rid of Vito, all of a sudden the story becomes much more interesting. Much more interesting
and much more depressing in a lot of ways. I think you mischaracterized that middle bit a little bit because what happens is Vito gets gunned down in the street. Sonny assumes control of the family because he's actually not the oldest, but everyone knows Fredo isn't any good at it. Or at least Fredo might be younger than Sonny. But anyway,
Fredo's the oldest.
Fredo is the oldest. Yeah. That's what I thought. But yeah, Fredo sucks. Like everyone knows Fredo's useless. And Sonny, on the other hand, he's a hothead. Yeah. And Tom Hagen keeps spending the entire film, or up until a point, trying to keep him from just going down and spilling blood in the streets and actually finding a way to handle this war responsibly. What happens is, in a really great sequence, Michael goes to visit his father and he realizes that all of the men who were there to protect his father from another assassination attempt to finish the job are gone.
They've all been called away.
They've all been called away by the cops, rather mysteriously. And so he hides his father in another room and he calls for backup. And then a car full of gangsters slowly drives by and they see Michael and they like, we'll just keep driving. That's not the plan. And then a corrupt police captain played by Sterling Hayden, the incredible Sterling Hayden.
From the Killing and Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He shows up and says basically, what? I'm corrupt. I was going to try to kill everybody, basically. And he like punches Michael and breaks his jaw. And Michael decides that everyone's like, oh, how do we solve this? Because now, like, our enemies are in league with the police. They're going to control everything. And Michael says, let's just kill them all. And everyone's just like, that's a stupid idea. And also, we're trying to keep you out of the family. So stop that. And Michael's like, no, I have the only way to do that. And so Michael is actually, just because he's so capable, he ends up assassinating a police captain and a rival mafioso and having to go on the lam in Sicily for a year.
And it's when he arrives in Sicily that he realizes who he is, and also he loses who he is.
A lot of ways. Because he was in love with Diane Keaton. They had a good relationship, as near as we could tell. And then as soon as he gets to Sicily, first thing he does is finds himself a new wife.
More or less.
A first wife, but yeah.
Well, he finds a new wife, and he essentially becomes his father in that moment. Something that we get the sense that he has been fighting throughout the first part of the movie. He does not want to become part of this family. He doesn't want to commit murder, but he finds that he has a talent for it. And this is why I called the film Shakespearean, because this is about Michael's moral fall.
Yeah.
As he rises in the ranks and finds how comfortable he is at becoming a horrible criminal, the worse of a person he is. He's like Macbeth. He has to just keep on killing to keep his power, but he has no regret in what he does.
Yeah, and the conventional crime narrative, and you even see this in something like Goodfellas, people like go too far and then pull back. Michael never pulls back. Michael always goes full speed ahead into his own ethical and moral downfall.
And there are two ways you can look at Michael. You can see him as being very capable and respectable for having the wherewithal and the agency to take over his family business and do it well, maybe even better than Vito, it could be argued. Mm-hmm. Or you could see him as a good man who decided rather actively to start committing murders just as a matter of course.
Well, it's a matter of business, and that's
I know,
really...
and I have a lot of trouble thinking of the crime family as legit in any way. They're not legit. They're rich, and they're violent, and they can get stuff done, and if you respect that ability to complete the task, then you can see these people as downright heroic. But they could also be plumbers. They don't necessarily, to quote Mickey Blue Eyes again, they don't have to be criminals.
Oh, yeah.
But the argument for Michael is that, well, it kind of has to be, because that's kind of what he knows. That's his talent.
Well, we're gonna explore more of that in the Godfather Part II. But yeah, in this first one, Michael just ends up becoming what he's good at. And what he's good at, it turns out, is not nice and it's not happy at all.
It's also what he previously hated.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see just the way that this industry chews people up and spits people out. Sonny ends up being slaughtered at a toll booth in one of the most violent deaths in movie history.
This side of Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, it's really just an incredible sequence, and just like you can't imagine like how many. I heard once they counted how many squibs they used, and it was ridiculous. And it's shockingly horrific and violent, and that leaves, of course, the room open for Michael to take power. But
and one of the most famous lines in film history, where he gets shot, and they're going to clean up after the shooting.
It's a different shooting.
Pardon?
It's a different guy.
It's the one out in the field, right? That's Sonny, right?
No, Sonny's the one at the toll booth. The one at the field is another guy. There's a lot of assassinations in this movie, so I totally get that you mix it up. Okay. But there's one guy who gets assassinated.
I just saw this last week, too.
They assassinate a guy who basically left Vito Corleone open to be assassinated in the first place. And they assassinate that guy in the middle of the field, and the guy says, leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
Take the cannoli, yeah.
Because his wife wanted the cannolis. It's a good bit. But that's the thing that I love about The Godfather, and I think that things that make it so unique amongst even many of its imitators. That sort of, we're doing all of these epic things. We're killing people in order to preserve the family. Also cannolis. Like, it's also, like, this is all very day-to-day for everybody. This is part of life. This is part of the industry. Everything is very interconnected.
It celebrates Italian culture.
Although,
it kind of linked Italian culture with crime in a lot of people's minds, rather unfortunately. I've talked to people of Italian descent who resent the gangster film movement because it kind of put a taint on their nationality.
And in fact, the word mafia isn't used at all in The Godfather, and it's only used in The Godfather Part II by people who are accusing the Corleone family of being in the mafia.
Word.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's Coppola is Italian, and Pacino is Italian.
Puzo
is Italian. These are all people who are very keen on exploring their own cultural roots, and a lot of attention is paid to those cultural markers. And it's not just that they eat cannoli. It's
no,
sort of
indicative.
The attitudes and the dress and the way they behave and speak and relate to one another as a family is all very markedly Italian. And I think that's also something that hadn't been seen in films, at least to that level, before. There are plenty of Italian characters. Look at like West Side Story from a few years earlier.
Right. Well, we have and this is something I wanted to bring up.
I was thinking of Sal Mineo.
I was about to say, but we've had Italian characters and things before, but like The Godfather made the Italian culture very marketable. I mean, The Godfather, when it came out, was a blockbuster. The Godfather, for a time, was the highest-grossing movie ever. Now, I want you to think about that, because one thing people talk about now is like, oh, God, the Oscars, they don't vote for all the blockbusters. Blockbuster culture changed.
They vote for the same kinds of movies, guys.
They vote for the same kinds of movies all the time, except the kinds of movies they vote for, typically. I mean, you have the occasional Mad Max Fury Road or Lord of the Rings that gets nominated, but they vote for movies that used to be blockbusters. The Sting, if you adjust for inflation, is still one of the highest grossing movies ever made. All right? These sort of intelligent, thought-provoking, expertly crafted, big epic dramas, not even genre films, really. They were blockbusters for a long, long time. The Godfather was a smash hit. And for a lot of reasons. Not just because it was good, it was violent, it was romantic, there was tons of stuff to it. And one of the things was they were selling that Italian culture. You look at gangster movies prior to The Godfather, you see the occasional one that deals with Italian culture, but they were much more in this sort of Scarface kind of vein. This more Gatling guns and guys going, meh, see? And a lot of them are great. I mean, like, White Heat is great. Public Enemy #1 is great. Scarface, the original Scarface is great.
I haven't seen the original Scarface. I've seen De Palma's Scarface, and it's fascinating to see how the crime family essentially was, or the notion of crime, the crime world was taken over by a bunch of coked up Sonnies, more or less. Like everybody became Sonny, like a decade later.
Yeah, it happens. So, and that's something that's kind of fascinating. But so The Godfather was a huge hit. That culture was a big part of it. But there's so many things in this movie that were very distinctive for their time. Gordon Willis was the director of photography on this, and he let this film fall into inky blackness in a way that a lot of people thought was actually must have been a mistake. Like, there was just so much darkness on camera. There's negative space in a lot of this movie that, it totally sold that they're living in this world of the shadows. But
the interiors are dark.
But movies weren't really filmed that way a lot of the time. It was really rare to see a film that was that inky. And that's really, really incredible. You had all of this naturalistic acting that we started to see more of in the 70s. People like Pacino and then De Niro entered the scene shortly after. Placed on this, you said, Shakespearean narrative. We could go on about The Godfather for forever because I think this is legitimately one of the great movies. Are there any last thoughts you want to have about this particular film? Just specifically?
No, I think we said it. Michael chooses to be swallowed up by his own culture, more or less, and I think that's an additional comment on sort of the immigrant experience.
There's a line
that there's a way to. A lot of immigrants come to this country and they try to assimilate and try to be as American as possible. Others try to sort of keep an eye on their culture, and that's a careful balance. Mm-hmm. How much are you your original culture? How much are you American now? And I think the comments that Coppola seems to be making is that relying entirely on your home culture in America may give you a lot of opportunity, but it might also lead to inner ruin, and that you have to assimilate and adapt a little bit.
I'm not sure that's it.
Because Kay is a very sympathetic character.
True.
Diane Keaton is not seen as any sort of adversary. In fact, she's the voice of reason in all of this.
She's also very much a victim of it. She's just swallowed up by it.
So when she tries to, Michael is using her to get out, and she's trying to help Michael out, and Michael is at first eager to climb out, but then starts pulling back a little bit. And when I guess he's the one who lets go, and he just sort of falls back into this land of moral ruination.
Well,
and it's kind of like he's taking advantage of the American dream and also ignoring it entirely at the same time.
The question I have, and it's something that I'm still haven't entirely decided how I feel about it. Michael leaves Kay. He goes to Sicily for a year. He gets married in Sicily. That marriage ends in tragedy. He comes back, and after a while, he asks Kay to marry him. Why? He doesn't need her at this point. She's not going to help him out. He's just going to pull her in. I think Michael understands the need for family, but I don't think he understands family. He pulled away from his family for so long that ultimately the real downfall of him, and the reason why Vito was so much more successful ultimately, I think, than Michael was, Vito balanced his family in the business. Very, very adeptly for the most part. Michael chooses business over the family, and the family falls apart, as we see in The Godfather Part II. The Godfather Part II is a very strange movie in a couple of different ways, but in one of the ways is it's both a prequel and a sequel at the same time. And it shows how Vito came to America as a child and then grew to become the Godfather, and Vito in the sequel is played by Robert De Niro, who got an Oscar for this performance as well. But it also shows what happened after the events of The Godfather as Michael moves further and further into the business world, further and further away from the family, and starts kind of ripping the Corleone empire apart.
Yeah, well, and we get to see that his impulsiveness through, I guess not impulsiveness, his plans, Michael's plans throughout the events of the first Godfather, turns out they were all kind of bad ideas. And he didn't sort of have he didn't really realize how big the business really was. He was completely blindsided by the amount of red tape there was in all of this.
Yeah.
Like, who do I have to glad hand? What politicians are in our pockets? Can we influence politics? Oh, we have to actively influence politics just to stay on top of crap. And he's ill-prepared for all of that. He seems overwhelmed. He tries to threaten people and they don't take him seriously. He doesn't have that same kind of imposing authority that Vito had.
Yeah.
And
he has to prove himself to everybody all the time.
And we learned by the end of the film that he essentially has one tactic that's effective. Which
is kill them all.
Which is more or less kill them all, including family members.
Yeah, as we're going to see throughout The Godfather Part II.
Meanwhile, we cut back and forth between that and Vito without any sort of paralleling. We just sort of get like one act and one act. And indeed, for a long time, you could get on VHS a gigantic cut of The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 cut chronologically.
So you could see Vito coming to America, then all of The Godfather, and then all of the Michael scenes of The Godfather Part 2. I've never seen that version, but it used to be on TV a lot.
Yeah. That's the way they ran it on TV, is this sort of big miniseries event.
It's my understanding that the original cut of The Godfather Part 2 actually cut back and forth between Vito and Michael more often, but that audiences found that kind of confusing. So they decided to just tell this chunk of Vito's story, then this chunk of Michael's story. But my problem with it is that, because you're right, it never really seems like there's a lot of rhyme or reason to when we're cutting to Vito. There's generally not like a good like transition between the past and the present, and as a result, it feels unfocused to me.
It doesn't feel unfocused if you think of their arcs, just Vito's rise crossing with Michael's fall and kind of them meeting in the middle. You can see it that way. Also, I think when you take it into consideration with what we know, and you have to have seen the first Godfather to get this.
Right.
And we were talking about I was just talking about assimilation, how Vito was able to sort of assimilate and enter this world that was just kind of beginning. These newer communities of Italian Americans that were just exploding on the coast in, I think it was 1917 when it first opens up.
In the movie,
in the teens and 20s.
Well, I think he comes to America just around the turn of the century, and then about 1917 we meet him as a young man.
Yeah, there you go. So he was in a unique position to be American in this new mini Italy that had just sort of sprung up. And I think that's a good comment on sort of the culture and how he was in this unique place to build that empire. Well, and how when Michael tries to do the same thing once it's already established, it doesn't work anymore.
Well, we also see in that flashback just the need to create a crime empire.
Find your footing.
Well, it wasn't just finding
opportunity.
It wasn't just finding your footing. It was a way to sort of assert power in a place where people were powerless. We see throughout that whole sequence with Robert De Niro that there is
there's already a crime boss.
There's a crime boss, but he's basically just a thug. He just walks around in his fancy suit and says, "You better pay me, or something will happen to you." And we see that, and he's Italian, and he's preying on his fellow Italians, and that offends Robert De Niro to no end. And so he actually arranges a very... I'm not sure how practical the plot was, because basically he just finds the most complicated way possible to follow the guy back to his apartment, which he apparently already knew where he lived, because he knew what apartment to wait at. Well, so I'm not sure what the point was.
Nobody's watching this guy. Nobody's following either of them. It didn't need to be that sneaky. It was incredibly filmed. It was exciting to watch, but it's kind of pointless.
Robert De Niro has a meeting with this guy. The meeting doesn't even go badly, and then the guy walks home through a big festival, and Robert De Niro jumps on rooftops to try to follow him throughout the city, but he ends up back at the guy's apartment, and he knew where he lived apparently. So that whole sequence is it looks cool, but it's sort of like a lot of people talk about the Copacabana sequence in Goodfellas, where
they walk in through the kitchen.
Yeah, Ray Liotta and who plays his wife in that movie?
Not Lorraine Bracco.
Lorraine Bracco. He's trying to impress Elaine Bracco, so he takes her to the Copacabana Club, and there's this incredible tracking shot where he it's all one shot, and he takes her through every single part of the back of the building, and he's just trying to impress her. And you realize when you watch that movie twice, you realize he makes a bunch of turns that are completely unnecessary, and circles rooms for no reason, partially just to show off how cool the tracking shot is. It was really no reason whatsoever to do that. It's pretty hilarious. But whatever, it's a movie. I'm not going to complain too much, and it's a great sequence. So meanwhile, in Michael's story, Michael has decided to get in bed with an aging mafioso. Again, we mentioned him earlier, Hyman Roth, played by Lee Strasberg, who is basically trying to increase mafia influence in Cuba. Wouldn't you know it, they're doing it right before the Cuban Revolution. Isn't it funny how Dirty Dancing Havana Nights keeps following us around? Because that's happening at the same time. It's all in the same universe.
And then there's that really great sequence where Michael, is kind of drunk one night, wanders into a dance club and sees a pretty young American woman winning a dance competition, and the hot young Cuban man that she came with, and he's inspired to write the step-up movies.
So Michael is trying to get involved in Cuba. Cuba is, of course, collapsing. There's a whole huge sequence with riots in Cuba. And this is, of course, when Michael realizes that at the beginning of the movie, there was an assassination on Michael's life. It failed.
An attempt, yeah.
An assassination attempt. It failed, and that's when he realizes, while he's in Cuba, that his brother Fredo was the one who, whether or not he knew there was an assassination is a little unclear, but he did betray the family. And there's that great sequence where he holds Fredo's face up and he kisses him on the mouth and says, "I knew it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart." And you're just acting. So good. Fredo, we find out that Fredo is just he's the oldest son. But he's pathetic, and no one trusts him to do anything because he's not good at anything.
And he has what I think is one of two great scenes. I mean, this is a film full of great scenes.
True, but
two great sort of character moments where he's cornered by Michael in this little tiny kind of kitschy looking 1970s room, even though it's not the 70s yet. Very 70s interior design in the 50s scenes. And I
think we're in the 60s by that point.
He's kind of, if it's Cuban Revolution, it'd be 59.
The movie takes place over about a decade and a half.
But he's sort of slouched in a chair, and Michael is standing over him, and they're both kind of darkly lit. And John Cazale just gets to yell about how he's always been overlooked. He knows he's bad at stuff, but he feels like he deserved more. And it's this really wonderful, plaintive wail of helplessness from this circle around Michael that he never really pays much attention to. He expects all of his family members and all the people around him just to be loyal lieutenants, and doesn't really take their feelings into consideration.
That's kind of my point. He's given up on the family. He sees it only as a business, and Fredo only gets in the way.
And that moment where Fredo finally gets to punch through that is a great moment of revelation, both for Fredo and for Michael.
And then Michael, here's again that conflict. Michael says he cannot kill Fredo while their mother is alive. Wait for that funeral. And then there's one of the great movie assassination scenes.
Is it a boat?
It's so great. But yeah, we just see everything just sort of collapse around Michael. The business is reasonably successful throughout. It goes through its ups and downs. But by the end of that movie, he's left with nothing. Kay is gone. He constantly shuts the door on her a couple of times throughout the whole series. And it's just him shutting out humanity in every conceivable way. And it's just him just becoming the devil, kind of, just throughout the entire series.
And after a while, we get the impression that that's his goal now, and the irony here is that now he's not even that good at being the devil. That makes him extra tragic. Not only did he shut out everything and compromise everything at the end of the first one, at the end of the second we realize he's not even good at that.
Well, because Vito Corleone, that's kind of the big parallel that we need to draw here in The Godfather Part II. Vito Corleone assembled all that power, and then the last real sequence we get of him before he goes to Sicily and closes out his arc. But in New York, there's this little tiny story about him helping an old lady keep her apartment from a landlord who's trying to raise her rent.
Oh, and he kind of shakes down the landlord a little bit.
And he shakes down the landlord a little bit, but he humiliates him a little bit, but he doesn't really hurt him.
Doesn't say much.
Yeah, he's just helping the community in the way that he can. He's giving back in as many ways as he can, and he's taking care of the people that he loves. Michael doesn't take care of shit. Michael works in the business, and he doesn't take care of anybody. In fact, the people that, like, end up doing the most good for him are the ones who end up suffering. There's a whole subplot with Frank Pentangeli, played by Michael V. Gazzo. This movie got nominated for 3 Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor. That's insane. And Robert De Niro won. They didn't even cut them. They didn't even, like, siphon anything off. Yeah. But there's this guy who thinks Michael betrayed him, and he's going to testify in front of Congress about the mafia, and they managed to shake him down. And his story ends super tragically. He ends up, like, kind of very much falling on his sword for the Corleone family. And, yeah, he just eats away at everything. So that was the end of The Godfather for a long time.
But the other character moment before we get to the end of The Godfather is the final scene.
Oh, yes.
Where we essentially is when the stories finally intersect. It's essentially the Vito story, and it's still a prequel to the first Godfather, but now Michael is an adult. It's Pacino, Sonny's back. All of the characters from the first movie are having dinner together, and they're waiting for Vito to show up. He's not in the room. And we get to see the man Michael has become before his fall one last time, before everything has gone to crap, really punching home how far he's fallen.
Well, and not just Michael, the whole family. We see that they're all together. Fredo is, kind of a loser, but everyone loves him. Sonny is a bit of a hothead. Sonny's a bit of a hothead, but everyone loves him too. Everyone is together and in love, and everything is very sweet before everything starts to collapse.
Sonny's a hothead, but Michael's in this position where he's like, well, I'm going to go off to war. I'm going to do something that's not you guys.
I'm going to do something for other people, he says.
Yeah. And doesn't happen that way.
That does not happen that way.
And I think the very final shot is him sitting alone at the table. And I think that is poignant and great, and I nearly cried. This is my first time watching The Godfather Part II ever.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool. I'd seen the first two.
I loved it, and I think, like you, I was a little bit baffled as to where these parallels were, and I'm kind of intellectualizing it, but I think it's not until that very final shot that it's all put into place.
Fair enough. I think, honestly, if I had to say, I think The Godfather Part I holds together a little bit better than The Godfather Part II, in which it feels a little loose in the middle. Like I said, it feels a little unfocused at times. It comes together at the end, but in the middle, it kind of becomes a little amorphous to me. And a lot of the actual shenanigans with Michael and his conspiracies and Cuba and Hyman Roth and all of the Congress stuff, it just ends up, I'm not really seeing a lot of emotional connection to a lot of it. It feels just like the business, and I'm less interested in that than I am with the stuff with Fredo or Kay.
I see it more as a clash of tone than anything. I think of the scenes of turn of the century, and it's all very warm browns and kind of intimate spaces where people are occupying small areas where they can kind of converse and be a lot closer, both physically and emotionally. I think of the modern day stuff, and I think of like big, open, cold, steely gray hallways and congressional courtrooms.
Yeah.
And it is sort of this conflict between the humanity and the heart at the heart of all of this evil and crime, and just sort of how it turns into empty red tape after a while. Speaking of empty red tape, to roll on into The Godfather Part III.
Okay, it's been 16 years, and they've decided to revisit it. Apparently, the title... I think it's interesting, the titles of The Godfather... According to Francis Ford Coppola, and certainly on a great scale, this is The Godfather Part II was the first sequel to just have a number on it.
I believe that.
Yeah, I think there might have been like one before that, but like before then, if there was a sequel, they would just call it something else. Like the sequel to Father of the Bride wasn't Father of the Bride 2, it was Father's Little Dividend back in the 1950s. Or there were all those different Tarzan movies, but it wasn't Tarzan the Ape Man 2, it was Tarzan and his mate, and Tarzan finds his son, and all that kind of stuff. And I think part of the idea behind that was there was no guarantee you've ever seen the original, so they weren't trying, because the TV was spotty, home video was non-existent, and that movie might not have even played in your town anyway, so they didn't want to discourage you.
Yeah.
The Godfather Part 2, everyone fucking saw The Godfather. And it does feel like a Part 2. In fact, it's a Part -1 as well, because it's a prequel, and it was a real continuation. Supposedly, Francis Ford Coppola wanted to call the third one The Death of Michael Corleone.
Okay.
Which makes a lot more sense than The Godfather Part III. I mean, it is Part 3, but it doesn't feel connected to anything. It feels like this weird, it's shiny epilogue. Like, it doesn't look like the other Godfathers. It doesn't feel like the other Godfathers. And frankly, it's not very good. I'm just going to say that right now.
It's really badly written, this movie. And which is, it's still Coppola and Puzo. They're still writing the screenplay to this thing.
Did Puzo write the screenplay to the third one?
I think he did.
Yeah, apparently so. Okay, well, fair enough.
It's still Coppola and Puzo. They're still, they are the ones who invented these characters, and it feels like a high school production of The Godfather. Like, Michael is now an older man. He's gray and he's wrinkled, and he's trying to get out of the business by being as benevolent as he can. He's trying to found these sort of Corleone foundations, and
he gives $500 million to like feed the poor in Sicily,
and that's like a Dr. Evil number. Like,
that's an insane amount of money.
A teenage Sofia Coppola, who plays his daughter, kind of like steps out at one point during this big party and says to a bishop, I think he's an archbishop, some high-ranking member of the Catholic Church, says, and here's a check for, and she like turns to the camera and says, $100 million. That's going to go to... No, that's later.
Oh, okay.
In the party, it's $100 million.
Oh, my bad.
In the closed room, it's $500 million.
Okay, fine.
And he says $500 million, and the bishop says, no, $600 million.
Oh, that's
because they're all Dr. Evil. And... It's like, she like smiles at the camera as if to say, wow, Michael sure is generous. We owe our life to him. And they cut to Michael and he's like, oh, you guys.
Because this one is basically Michael Corleone meets the Pope. Like, that's the title. This feels like fan fiction, where it's like, wow, how far can Michael Corleone go? Well, he's going to do business with the fucking Pope. And the thing is, there's like this history in the Catholic Church of like...
Total corruption.
A lot of corruption, if you go back far enough in particular, today, but different kinds. And there was this whole tradition of basically rich people buying forgiveness for sins. And this is what Michael Corleone is trying to do. He's trying to buy his way into heaven. It's like Francis Ford Coppola finally remembered, oh, right, they're Catholic.
Right. And
that's actually a thing.
Is redemption possible for these people? And... there is a scene of confession, and it's maybe the best scene in an otherwise bad movie.
Arguably.
But...
I think there are a couple of good scenes here and there.
Nothing that elevates it. But yeah, because this is a series about legacy, we have to sort of see where he's going to go at the end of his career and who's going to take his place. And it turns out the criminals just get more violent and more hot-headed as the generations pass.
Yeah.
As represented by Andy Garcia, the sexiest man alive.
Who shows up in a leather tuxedo.
Yeah.
So, as with the other Godfathers, each Godfather movie opens with a big party in which Godfather business is intercut with family business. And every Godfather movie ends with a slaughter of some kind. And in the middle, there are oranges, which, by the way, I didn't mention. In a rather arbitrary choice, they've decided that every time you see an orange in the Godfather movies, there is either a Corleone member is going to die or an attempt will be made on their life.
Oranges.
Every time. I don't know what...
It's a strange motif.
It just seems kind of random, but they really... It might have been an accident in the first movie. It's not an accident in the second movie, and it's really not an accident in the third.
Where somebody dies via orange. They're pelted to death. Somebody pours a bunch of oranges into a tennis ball cannon. No, that doesn't really happen.
There's a meeting with a whole bunch of mafiosos in the middle of the Godfather Part III, and in the middle of the table, there's a whole like giant pile of oranges, and we're just like, this isn't going to go well. And then you hear a helicopter, and a helicopter like pulls out, a bunch of guys with machine guns shoot everyone at the top of this skyrise building, and there's this old guy who's just like, everyone's like, old guy, stop trying to get your code. It's my lucky code. And he gets shot a million times. And it's just sort of like...
Which they ripped off in Star Trek Into Darkness, if you recall.
Did they?
Remember they gathered all those generals together in that room just so Khan could fly up to the window and blast them all?
But did Pike have a lucky coat?
No, he got out. Kirk and Spock got out.
Anyway,
they're the same movie.
Andy Garcia plays the illegitimate son of Sonny Corleone. He is young, he is hot-headed, and he is very eager to get into the business. He has an ongoing beef, which they don't really articulate why very well, with the guy...
Joe Mantegna.
With Joe Mantegna, the great Joe Mantegna.
I love Joe Mantegna.
Joe Mantegna's he's one of my favorite actors, actually. Love him in Homicide. I love him in
House of Games.
Searching for Bobby Fischer. And it totally makes sense he'd be in a Godfather movie. So he's taken over Al Pacino's illegitimate empire, while Al Pacino runs all the legitimate businesses. Andy Garcia hates Joe Mantegna. They have a huge beef. In the middle of this big party, while Al Pacino's getting a medal from the Pope. He tells Andy Garcia and Joe Mantegna to make up, and they reach in for a handshake. Andy Garcia pulls in for a hug, and he bites part of Joe Mantegna's ear off. This is not a subtle film. This is the film where, oh my god, so much stupid shit happens. So
the entire first act.
Okay, please help me.
Is Michael trying to go straight, right? And Andy Garcia is trying to pull him back. He knows that Joe Mantegna is in charge of this. There's this tension underneath it all, but he is essentially turned into, more or less, a complete weakling now. He wants to rest on his laurels, say that he's a good man, and just do legit stuff. And so much of the movie is devoted to how he goes straight, who he's paying off, how he talks to popes, shaking people's hands. It's all the boring scenes of him filling out forms, essentially saying, I'm not the Godfather anymore. Here's some, I'm okay. And I think it's kind of fascinating in how boring it is.
Well, again,
because all of this talk in the previous two films of legacy and nationality and familial bonds has given way to, in 1990, the age of the age of the yuppie was still kind of there. How it is just sort of boring, business-like red tape and shifting money around, and there's no personality to it at all.
Well, again, he chose business over family, and this is what happened.
And this is what happened to business. And even though it takes place before 1990, I think Coppola was really commenting on the business world at the time and how soulless it had become. And had he stayed with that theme about sort of the soullessness of the business and turned it into essentially the mafia version of Wall Street, it might have been kind of an interesting film. But then Michael Corleone has a stroke. Right after he has that really fantastic line, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in, and then he has a stroke. Had the film ended right there, it would have been great.
No,
it would have been 67 minutes long, and I think it would have really put a cap on how boring the mafia life had become.
Okay, I agree it would have been shorter and that would have been better, but I don't think it would have been good, because you got to remember, before then, we have a whole bunch of stupid shit. Andy Garcia, which, by the way, this movie got nominated for a ton of Oscars, mostly undeserved, I think. I think it's legacy talking a lot in that case. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen, but it's not very good. The only actor in this movie to get an acting nomination was Andy Garcia. Andy Garcia could be a great actor. He's not in this movie. He's really not. He's all style and all slickness, and it feels like a betrayal of the first two Godfather movies, which had style, but again, they were intimate. They pulled back the veil. It wasn't just about how cool these gangsters are, like in all those early movies I told you about, like in White Heat and Scarface. It was about intimacy and realism, and here, now that the cinematography is slicker, now that the young people are more vapid, and the old people are trying to get out of it, it just ends up coming across entirely false. There's this whole sequence with Andy Garcia, and he's sleeping with Bridget Fonda, who I was excited. I like her as an actor. I thought she'd be in the whole movie. She's got two scenes.
She's just in those opening scenes.
She's sleeping with Andy Garcia. Two guys break in. They're going to kill Andy Garcia. He kills them in the most stylish fashion possible, and then he slaps Bridget Fonda on the bottom, and I'm just like, that's not what The Godfather is. Well, this is stylish Godfather ripoff bullshit.
Had Coppola the directorial wherewithal to comment on the fact that crime families had become this sort of vapid, butt-slapping young man generation, and had the older characters maybe commented on the characters of the younger ones, or we really kind of just got lost in the empty hedonism of the younger generation. Again, that would have been an interesting point, but he doesn't do that either.
No. And instead, what we have is Andy Garcia ends up kind of coming across smelling like a rose, except for the fact that he's sleeping with his cousin.
Yeah.
Which they really are weirdly fine with. He ends up having a romantic affair.
She walks right up to him. She's played by Sofia Coppola. She walks right up to him and says, "Hey, I know I'm your first cousin, but want a bone?" More or less.
More or less. She comes on to him really hard, right at the beginning. And he doesn't fight it too hard, and they end up having an ongoing romantic sexual affair. And like everyone knows about it. Like Al Pacino finds out about it. It's like, you need to stop doing that. That's wrong. But they don't actually like put a stop to it. They don't actually do anything serious. What weirds me out is when Kay finds out, and even she says she's not going to do anything to stop it. And I'm like, Kay, you were the moral center here. And this is why I brought up the whole Greek tragedy element to the trilogy, because that's very Greek. That's the
incest.
Yeah, once you hit that level of sort of the family sort of eating itself alive, that's when you end up in this sort of Oedipus Electra kind of area.
You would think they would save the revelation of their affair for some like dark climactic moment, but it's one thing that happens along the course of the film.
Yeah. Just one of many weird things.
In a really gross way, they make gnocchi together.
It's really, really an awkward
Like she says,
sequence.
hey, you want to show me? It's like the pottery scene in Ghost.
If it was less sexy by a million. But it's not sexy
because they're rolling up tiny balls of gnocchi and touching hands and rolling gnocchi aside.
It does not work at all.
Why is there just gnocchi dough out?
A lot of people single out Sofia Coppola's performance as one of the reasons why the movie doesn't work. And I think it's fair to say that she is out of her depth as a performer. I think the character she plays, Mary Corleone, is young and naive, and I think her performance helps solidify that a little bit. At the same time, she's acting with Al Pacino and Diane Keaton and even Andy Garcia, who even not at his best is a more accomplished, more confident actor. And I think it's fair to critique that. I think it's totally fine. I think it's interesting. A lot of people point out that she actually replaced Winona Ryder, who was going to star in the role, and then she had to back out. I believe it was exhaustion. She'd just done a whole bunch of movies and then backed out. A bunch of people wanted the role. Madonna wanted the role, but they decided she was too old at the time. 'Cause she's supposed to be a teenager.
Yeah.
And a lot of people single that performance out, but I think it's interesting that no one talks about... Okay, so Robert Duvall didn't come back for The Godfather Part III. They wanted him to, but they offered him a comically low amount of money compared to all the other returning cast members, so he said, fuck you. You can do it without me. But they still needed someone to do his part. They didn't recast Tom Hagen, but they needed the Tom Hagen character to be like the legal guy. So what actor do you get when you can't get Robert Duvall, one of the great actors, period? Who do you get? Who's the guy?
Well, I know. Because I'm rich Francis Ford Coppola, and I'm in Las Vegas just having a good time, why don't we take in a show? Hey, wait a minute. See that guy on stage?
Let's get George Hamilton.
Let's get George Hamilton, because we need a Vegas crooning vampire in the role of Robert De Niro.
Now, I like George Hamilton. I got nothing against George Hamilton as a performer. He is not an actor on the same level as Al Pacino or Robert Duvall. He is weirdly out of his element and strangely miscast. Like, I do not get the rationale on that one. Like, it's super bizarre. The one performance I do really, really like in this one, though, I think Pacino does fine, but I think Diane Keaton finally gets more of her due here, because in the first movie, Kay is actually not in it that much, and she really is just sort of representative of opportunity lost. Yeah. And then in the second movie, we see her really strike back against Michael Corleone in some very sharp, painful ways, and she gets some good scenes, but she's still kind of a prop in his life. And here, when we're reintroduced to her, she's free of him, and she made her life her own, and she is confident. And it really mirrors a lot of the ways, like Diane Keaton, after those early Godfather movies, she became one of the biggest actors in the world. Yeah. She got her own career, and she got her own presence, and her scenes with Michael Corleone, now that they're more on an even keel, are so much more dynamic than a lot of the other scenes they've shared together throughout the series. And, of course, I love Diane Keaton in anything anyway. So that stuff was really, really good. And there's a couple of really good set pieces, these action set pieces. There's a huge assassination at a parade that is very well staged.
Yeah.
But at the same time...
The shooting on the stairs is really notable.
Very epic. Like, you know, they leave an opera, and then something even more operatic happens on the stairs outside, and it's perfect. But at the same time, yeah, this is basically a whole bunch of rambling bullshit in an attempt to finally get Michael some sort of, if not redemption, then punishment for his misdeeds. And it's a whole lot of work to accomplish something very simple. And it's something that they kind of already accomplished at the end of The Godfather Part II.
They accomplished it. Well, they didn't redeem him. They just sort of shown that he had fallen.
But I don't think he's redeemed here either. I think he just acknowledges that he fucked up.
Yeah, same deal. He finally gets a moment where instead of giving $100 million to the Catholic Church, he just confesses.
Yeah.
Goes to confession.
Yeah. But here's the deal. When Michael Corleone confesses, he doesn't just confess. He confesses to the guy who's about to become the Pope.
Yeah.
Like, that's how fucking epic Michael Corleone... Which is not, it just rings false.
You don't confess to some, country priest just starting out, which I think would have been a lot more appropriate. But
probably, yeah. It would have been actually kind of sweet, and it would have been a good contrast.
What we need is, going my way guy. I forgot the character's name. Bing Crosby and Going My Way.
Well, there you go.
Somebody that benevolent to balance his wickedness.
Yeah.
And he confesses, and it's not like a litany of everything he's done. It's just sort of like 2 or 3 of his biggest crimes.
The main bullet points,
yeah.
like killing Fredo. That's the big one.
He says, I confess, I killed men. Oh, really? Could you go into a little bit more detail there? Because that's kind of a big part of your life. You didn't just kill men one day and Tuesday.
Look, I can't keep track of them all. I killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
But now it's okay, right?
And the
priest is just no, that's not okay.
Well, yeah, and the priest even says, it's God's point to judge, and there are things you can't do in this world. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't absolve him. He just says something very comforting, but he very pointedly doesn't say you're forgiven.
Well, he also says that there might be hope for redemption for you, but I don't think you realize that that's possible.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to live with this guilt.
Even the priest says, I don't know how redemption is possible for you. Mm-hmm. The guy who's about to become Pope says, but he doesn't, I don't know what you can do.
But
This isn't a say Hail Marys sort of thing.
He doesn't say it in a cynical way.
No,
he doesn't say it in a mean way. He's just well, you did all that.
Yeah.
That sucks.
So, I like that he has this moral reckoning, and he realizes that there's no easy way out, and there never was an easy way out. And I think that's a good scene. And then there's the big shooting on a stairs.
There's a tragic thing.
Tragic things happen.
Twins get killed.
Then we cut forward, and the final scene of the movie is Michael's on a chair, and he just kind of dies.
He dies, and he drops an orange.
Oh, did he?
Yes!
Oh, God, I didn't even miss that.
Yeah, he just dies, and then just an orange falls out of his hand.
Oh,
and
fuck you.
I know, it's this stupid... It turns something that was this weird, subtle, kind of almost like a little game, like seeing Hitchcock's cameos. Oh, where's the orange? Someone's about to die. Oh, that's cute. And it just turns it into a stupid-ass punchline. The Godfather Part III is made by so many talented people that I wouldn't call it a complete wash. It's not a good movie.
No, it's really boring.
It's bland.
I don't know what the point is supposed to be.
The tone is all over the place. The acting is all over the place.
I don't like Andy Garcia's character. We're supposed to see him as this sort of charming hothead, and I guess, but he's a great looking guy, but I can't really say how we're supposed to feel about him.
He doesn't have a clear arc or anything like that. The whole thing is he's just got to end up, will he decide to stay with Michael's daughter or not? And ultimately that decision kind of gets taken away from him anyway. So it's kind of a non-character. You really could have... The Godfather is a story about generations. I mean, that's what the second movie really hammers home. And it's about that kind of legacy. This would have been a great opportunity to say goodbye to Michael and sort of usher in a new age. They airball all the new age stuff.
Yeah.
And some of the Michael stuff is okay, but it's padded and it's pointless, and it has only one point, and it could have been done much quicker.
Yeah.
This could have, you said it could have been a 67-minute movie. This could have been a 20-minute movie. This could have been a one-act play of Michael Corleone going to confession.
Yeah.
That alone.
If the entire movie was just in a confessional.
Yeah, Michael Corleone, he's old, he's dying, he's going to confession, and it's just him listing everything he's ever done, and the priest going, holy shit. And then coming to some meaningful conclusion afterwards. That would have been enough. This movie is a whole lot of effort. It's a 3-hour fucking movie for ultimately one scene's worth of material. It's not good.
It's not good. Here's what I want to see. Godfather Part IV takes place in the present. Takes place in 2018 or whenever they make it. And the family's gone. We catch up with the kids, and they're just doing stuff. They have nothing to do with the mob. They're just getting jobs in local restaurants. One of them's trying to get a podcast off the ground.
Yeah. One of them owns an orange farm. Oh, no!
Yeah, and there's going to be all of this foreboding. Are they going to go back to a life of crime? No. Just the legacy has vanished now. And it would just be sort of this very brief realist drama about what the kids are doing now and how they have no idea where they came from.
Well, that would be interesting.
I think that would be a really great sort of poignant button.
Maybe.
But don't make it 3 hours. Make it 80 minutes.
I like to see Richard Linklater's Godfather movie. It's a shame it ends on such a sour note, but the first two Godfathers are brilliant. And, they should be seen and they should be studied, and they're great. But Godfather Part III. Ugh.
Coppola just had this really hard, like sharp turn downward in 1980 specifically. it was one from the heart, really, that kind of ruined everything for him. He did this big impassioned vanity project. Nobody liked it. Some people.
It has a few defenders,
but yeah, there's not a lot of people who are really all about One from the Heart. And after that, he just couldn't get anything of quality really put together.
There's a few exceptions to that. I think Tucker, A Man in His Dream is a really solid movie.
Okay.
I think that's a great movie. It's about stars Jeff Bridges as a guy who invented like this new top of the line car in I think the 1940s, and it had all these
real guy. It's a biography.
Yeah, it's a biography, and it's about a guy who tried to change the automotive industry, and the automotive industry actually colluded against him in order to destroy him and make sure that they didn't have to actually improve their product. And it's a really sharp, very fun, lively, excellent motion picture. People do not talk about it enough.
Okay.
And he's made a few other good ones. I like his Dracula. I know you don't.
His Dracula sucks. Come on.
I think of the many Grisham adaptations, I think his The Rainmaker is very respectable.
Also a lively film. But he also did films like Jack, and then all of a sudden, I don't understand Jack at all. And he did something similar a decade later with, or I guess 20 years later, with Youth Without Youth, about another person who's aging differently than they ought to, and movies like Tetro, and then. Was his last film Twixt, or has he done something since then? Twixt is garbage.
Well, I never saw Twixt the way Twixt was meant to be seen, with him like mixing it live for the audience.
Yeah.
Twixt was a sort of pulpy supernatural thriller starring Val Kilmer,
who goes to a small town to write a mystery novel, finds a local mystery, and then falls asleep to get help from the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe, who appears in his dreams.
And the idea was they shot all of this, like a ton of different material, and that Francis Ford Coppola would actually like sit at the back of the theater and
edit it live.
And he would add or change whole like subplots depending on what the audience was reacting to, which is a really fascinating idea. But they ended up just releasing it as one cut of the movie, which I've never seen. You say it sucked?
It sucked.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
So Francis Ford Coppola is an interesting filmmaker. And
by the way, there's vampires.
Good.
Like not just in the dreams. There's like actual vampires lurking around.
Good.
And they have braces.
Like on their car races?
No, braces on their fangs.
Oh, braces. Yeah. I was like drag racing? What's going on? Okay. I would not surprise me. That's the stories I've read about
Alden Ehrenreich plays one of the vampires.
Oh, I like Alden Ehrenreich.
I like him too.
Fun. So that's the Godfather trilogy. Next week we'll be back to doing our usual shtick where you pick a really bad movie, or at least a notoriously bad movie, and we're going to be reviewing a good movie along with it to sort of, bring out the positive and negative qualities in both.
A good beer pairing for the meal.
We'll talk about the films we chose at the end of the episode, because now we got to backtrack and we got to do all the new releases as well. And we're going to start with, because I know you're most excited about it, the new Adam Sandler movie.
Yeah.
The week of, which I didn't see. Whitney, take us through this as quickly as possible.
Okay, this is the fourth film that's part of Adam Sandler's six-film deal that he made with Netflix. The Meyerowitz Stories doesn't count. That was like
he just happens to be in that.
Yeah. Yeah, he made a deal with Netflix several years ago about to make 6 feature films specifically for the streaming platform. And he was allowed to do whatever he wanted. He started with The Ridiculous Six, which is, I think, even to this day, one of Netflix's most successful movies. Like, they had the most views on that one than anything in the platform's history.
And I reviewed it, so I'm one of those clicks.
I reviewed it too. I watched that dang thing.
What if it was mostly film critics?
It might have been. Just film critics. People are watching this film out of duty or obligation. Adam Sandler has long been a critical bugaboo, and all critics tend to agree on just how awful his films are, and they're all awful in the same way.
Well, they're not all awful.
They're not all awful.
He started off okay, and there's a lot of his early movies are funny, at least. Whether or not they're good is some level of debate, but I think Billy Madison has a lot of laughs in it. Happy Gilmore has a lot of laughs in it. Waterboy has a lot of laughs in it. But then his movies started falling back on some really tired jokes.
I think it's starting maybe with Big Daddy. When he started playing fathers, when he became a father, that's when his movies started to kind of suck in earnest. Because even though he's trying to sell this really kind of wholesome point about family togetherness in all of his movies, about the relationships between fathers and sons and how you may mess up, but it's okay if you can play ball together.
He wanted to get wholesome.
He wanted to get not just wholesome, but like supra-Rockwellian about it. Like, he wanted to make sure the wholesomeness was really jammed home, and that was always juxtaposed with a type of humor that was really, really mean. He tended to base a lot of his jokes in mocking others. It was especially grievous in Grown Ups 2, which was a film about, the family getting together and family togetherness, and there was a subplot about standing up to bullies. And the whole thing about Adam Sandler's character and his son both had parallel bullies that they had to stand up to.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they bully everybody else.
Yeah, all the humor comes from the bullying. I've heard a lot of comments on reviews like yours, for example, of this particular movie, where people talk about why are you talking about how mean the movie is? Why aren't you just reviewing it? Well, because comedy can be very subjective, and we're sort of implying a certain level of taste.
Yeah,
here's what our taste is, and a certain level of unpleasantness can cease to be funny after a while. And if you find that funny, let's ignore all separation, judgment, whatever. If you find that funny, fine. But if you hear mean-spirited comedy and you think, "Oh, I want to watch that," then the review has still done its job. A good review isn't necessarily a review that mirrors your opinion. A good review is one that tells you what you need to know in order to help make up your mind. So if you read a critic who seems to hate a movie for all the reasons you would like it, you know you're going to like that movie. That's not a bad review necessarily.
Yeah.
So
it's like Roger Ebert famously was really hard on a lot of slasher movies and horror movies. He wasn't so keen on them, and he talked about and there's this horrible scene where somebody's face gets eaten by spiders, and I just rub my hands. Ooh, I want to see a scene where a person gets their face eaten by spiders.
And
great.
And sure enough, The Beyond is a very good movie.
He gave a really bad review to The Beyond, which is spectacular.
It's one of the best horror movies of the 80s.
I agree with every one of his points, but it's also a spectacular movie. Yeah, it's cheap AF, and it's great. But yeah, I write a review of something like The Week Of, and I note how cruel it is, and it becomes so cruel that it's not funny anymore.
Yeah, and that's
kind of the point of why I bring it up.
You aren't expected to just they have good comic timing, therefore it's funny. That's not necessarily true. There are other factors at play here.
So the story of The Week Of is Adam Sandler plays kind of a lower middle class guy who has a huge family who's all converged on his little suburban home for his daughter's wedding. And it's the week of his daughter's wedding.
I get it.
He, as father of the bride, has decided to pay for everything and try to arrange everything with his very, very limited means, even though the father of the groom, played by Chris Rock, is an incredibly wealthy cardiologist and can easily pay for, 100 of these weddings without, worrying about it.
Okay.
And so there's a little bit of fatherly pride, and that's where all of the drama comes from, is his pride in trying to get things together. Very Father of the Bride ripoff material.
Father of the Bride / Betsy's Wedding. Yeah, those are both good movies. Actually, all three of those are good movies. Father of the Bride was a remake, but yeah.
Even the remake of Father of the Bride is pretty good.
Yeah, I like that movie.
We're so laser focused on his pride that there can be some comments made on sort of the paterfamilias of the family trying to make good with his family, even though he has limited means, and being creative in that situation might be able to prove that he actually has something to offer. But he repeatedly fails, and we're supposed to laugh at his hardships. He puts all of his relatives up in, he owns a really cheap hotel that's constantly breaking down. He puts all of his wealthy relatives up in this cheap hotel and tries to say, it's the executive suite. This all looks really good. Let's try to fool them into making it look like it's more expensive, but I don't know, it just doesn't work. It's just not funny, and we're meant to see him as both really pathetic in trying to do this, but also really kind of sympathetic for trying so hard.
And on paper, you can make that work. The pride goeth before the pratfall kind of thing, where you're trying to put on an air of something and it keeps collapsing and you keep trying to backtrack and find a way to make it work. I've seen a lot of comedies that have made that work.
And the script presents him as this very well-meaning guy. The film, however, presents something much darker. He is a really mean guy. He's a really cruel guy. He mocks people. He has to look after I think it's his father. Maybe it's his grandfather.
I don't know.
There's an elderly World War II veteran who has lost his legs to diabetes. He's not all together, and his nurse, played by a really hapless Steve Buscemi, who's just over the phone for most of the movie, says, just take care of this guy. It'll be fine. And Adam Sandler is ill-prepared. He doesn't have a place set up for this guy, and he is seen as nothing but a complete horrible nuisance. Having to lift this guy and take him to the bathroom. Oh, what a horrible man. He has to go to the bathroom. take care of this man, for God's sake. Try to use your limited resources to find a way to make this guy comfortable in a way that makes him happy. They don't care about this guy's happiness. The fact that he's legless and in a wheelchair is meant to be kind of a joke.
Is he cruel? Because you can make that sort of work if he's like a complete asshole who treats everyone like shit. Like, you can kind of make that work.
He's kind of he's old and he's out of it. And he just sort of, like, communicates in, like, single... like grunting syllables. And he's able to be bribed in one scene. He's like, you should need to go here. No, I don't want to go. Well, invite you to the bachelor party, you get to see breasts. Okay, fine, I'll go. And, I guess he's a bit of a cad in that regard, but more than anything, he is seen as a foil for how hard Adam Sandler's life has become. Worse still, they have to look after a young man named Noah who has been let out of rehab to attend this wedding. And his two doting parents have a long printed list of triggers that they have to avoid, including loud rooms and loud music, and he is seen as nothing but a nuisance. This suicidal addict is a comic foil for Adam Sandler, and his problems are meant to be seen as comedic inconveniences. That's mean, okay?
I'm not cynical enough to find that funny.
No, if it had been a darker filmmaker who was just saying all of these people are horrible assholes. Picture Todd Solondz.
I can picture John Waters making that work.
John Waters could, because he would have made all those characters into peculiar somehow, and they would have just been butting heads a little bit.
Like, the whole world would have seemed a little surreal, and therefore you would have gotten away with a lot of that.
And John Waters, unlike Adam Sandler, has affection for all of his characters. John Waters writes horribly depraved, disgusting people, and he loves every single one of them.
That's another thing.
Adam Sandler seems to hate humanity, provided it fits outside of his little limited worldview. He's seen as this good father, but he never talks to his daughter. He has horrifically violent screaming matches with his wife, played by Rachel Dratch, that echo throughout the house, and the kids are so used to it, they just sort of ignore it, and the joke is they just go about their business while their parents are threatening each other's lives in the upper room. Well, I don't think that's funny.
I mean, here's the you're saying Adam Sandler here, and granted, he produces these things, he has a particular stamp he puts on most of his material.
He's not the director, but he is the co-writer.
It's directed by Robert Smigel, who actually is
who's done
very
a few
funny.
Good ones. He did Wayne's World 2.
But he didn't direct that.
Didn't he?
No, this is his feature directorial debut.
Oh, I guess he wrote Wayne's World.
He's written a lot of movies. He wrote Look Well, that pilot we did for Canceled Too Soon. Right. He did a lot of Saturday Night Live. I don't think he did Wayne's World at all. He wrote he co-wrote Hotel Transylvania 2, which is actually very funny. It's not as good as the first Hotel Transylvania, but it's very funny. So it's odd that it missed the mark so much, because it seems like he's pretty deft at that.
He was in Wayne's World 2. He just acted in Wayne's World 2.
All right, that makes more sense now. But that's just a damn shame, is what that is.
Yeah, and I understand that these movies get made because Adam Sandler is really a nice guy in real life.
Well, people do enjoy watching.
People go to them, and people enjoy working with him. This is how he has sort of a circle of regulars who come back time and time again. And there is a very, very old-fashioned kind of wholesomeness that he clearly is kind of coating his cake with. He's trying to sell something very, very old-fashioned, very conservative, if you will. But it's all undercut by this really mean-spirited humor that I have trouble getting past. The Week Of is especially bad because not only does it have the mean-spirited humor, but nobody seems really invested in this one. You look at something like Little Nicky, at least they're selling the dumb ridiculousness of that notion. You go to something like The Week Of, and everybody's just sleepwalking. There's no comedic energy. There's no slow burn. There's no pep or punchline. It's just sort of meandering from one scene to the next. It moves in a very expected way. There's a big unearned corny redemption scene at the end when the wedding finally goes down, and
again,
and it's like everybody's kind of improvising, but they just go with the laziest take. And it runs almost 2 full hours.
Wow. Okay, that sounds ridiculous to me. But I think it's interesting. We go to these kinds of comedies for the same shtick over and over again. We want it. Yeah. We want it to have some sort of corniness at the end. We want there to be all that slapstick. We want to see the inconvenience. We want to see some gross out humor now and then. That's fine. But I think there's a difference between sort of accepting these as passable entertainment and letting them off the hook.
Yeah.
And I think people talk about Adam Sandler, he's so popular. Okay, fine. Ask yourself this. In 100 years, which Adam Sandler movies will we still be talking about? I think maybe a couple.
Maybe some of the early ones.
I think Punch Drunk Love will probably get some conversations
if that,
still. I think...
again, that's one where he's actor more than creative force.
I think we might still look on like Happy Gilmore with some fondness, but most of these, like, I look at, when I think about the works of Adam Sandler or some of the other sort of disposable sort of oeuvres where they're okay, but people defend them saying they're popular. You know what else was popular? Francis the Talking Mule.
Those are huge hits.
Francis the Talking Mule was a series of films about a guy who had a talking mule. There were 7 enormously financially successful movies.
Seven of them.
In the 1950s. 7 of them in one decade. It was a huge hit. When was the last time you saw one? These were huge,
when was the last time you
successful comedies?
Saw it, like, offered in even, like, a streaming queue?
Be honest. A lot of you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. Like, a lot of you never heard that before in your life. There's not a bunch of DVD compilations out there that are readily available.
You can't get the Blu-ray box set of Francis the Talking Mule.
I think some of them are, and there might have been a collection at one point, but no one gave a shit. You never saw a banner ad on Facebook. They're gone. Popularity can fade.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting segue into what may be the most popular motion picture of the year, Avengers Infinity War. Avengers Infinity War is the latest film from Marvel Studios. It is their biggest crossover event ever. And I think it's worth pointing out that the first Avengers movie nailed the crossover event. It's a somewhat simplistic story, but it gave you everything you needed. All the heroes interacted. It was very, very cool. But now it is immense, and it is sprawling, and we have wizards, and sci-fi, and gods.
Talking raccoons, and...
Yeah. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is vast at this point.
All of the crazy stuff introduced in Doctor Strange and the Thor movies and the Guardians of the Galaxy movies all crashes together.
Now,
and down on Earth and many, many different strange settings and the fields of Wakanda and distant planets and forges, all of it's in there.
Now, again, this review of Avengers Infinity War, we're going to start off talking very generally. We're going to say a few things about the plot, most of which you can probably piece together either from trailers or stuff like that, but we might go into a little bit more detail. We won't spoil who dies. We're not going to spoil any of the major plot points. We're going to speak about it in a very general way, and then we're going to give you a countdown eventually, because then we do need to talk about at least some of the spoiler material in order to review it as a film, as opposed to a, that was neat kind of movie experience, which is what we do.
Yeah.
So, first off, general impressions. Pretty neat.
Pretty neat.
I liked it. There was a bunch of cool stuff in it.
It does what it says on the tin. They are touting this as a big crossover event. It has all of the characters, it has all the action, and you know what? It has all that stuff.
Most of it.
And it does it all really well.
There's a couple of characters who I find conspicuously absent, but we'll talk about that in the spoilers.
I suppose so. But, this is going to be a film that is not based on any kind of new ideas about the Marvel Universe. It's just about getting all these characters together and having them fight a lot of really horrible bad guys, and the stakes are really high.
No, I disagree with that. I think the way that they tell this narrative is actually very freewheeling and a lot less structured than most Marvel movies, because they have so many characters. It just jumps across galaxies and planets, and
it's
as a result, it feels very different. It feels almost more like a Marvel's version of Nashville in a way.
To me, it feels very procedural because it's based around these 6 MacGuffins, the Infinity Stones that have been teased throughout the previous 18 films in this series. And there's in previous movies, these Infinity Stones were central MacGuffins. Now there are 6 of them, and we have them all together. We have one gigantic super MacGuffin.
Well, Thanos is trying to bring them all together.
Thanos is trying to bring them all together. Thanos is an evil purple super god. He's essentially a bigger version of the Hulk in this version of the story. And he's an intelligent version of the Hulk, and he's a titan, and he's a gigantic bruiser. He wears a gauntlet on his hand that has empty spots for the Infinity Stones that he plans on gathering. Once he has them all, he will be able to snap his fingers and murder half the universe. That's his goal.
Now, in the comics, he wanted to do that because he was in love with the living personification of death, which brought a certain weird romanticism to him.
And he does it right away in the comics.
Oh, yeah.
In the comics, he snaps his fingers right away, and just half the Marvel universe is gone.
That was like the beginning of the Infinity Gauntlet. But in the movies, they took out that whole personification of death deal, and they decided to make him this sort of disturbing pragmatist.
Well, they made him an environmentalist. Yeah,
the idea is he comes from a planet that destroyed itself because of lack of resources and overpopulation. So his thing is, I'm just going to randomly kill half the people on every planet I run into, and then the people who die, okay, that sucks. But the people who live will be able to live longer and with more peace with the environment. And
in his mind, they're also able to sort of wistfully remember those lost and kind of build on the ashes, and that will strengthen them as a community.
He has acolytes who, as he's killing you, will say things like, "Rejoice, for although you die so that others may live." And that's kind of neat. Now, I like that as a villain. It's better villain motivation than most Marvel villains.
I suppose, although if he's looking for all these widgets that let him do anything, can't he just reallocate resources? Or, give people more space, or, like, double the size of the universe? There's all kinds...
Oh my god!
There's all kinds of stuff
ruined the whole movie.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds. His motivation makes no sense.
Oh my god! You just ruined the whole movie. Oh my god! You just destroyed it. Oh my god!
Overpopulation has nothing to do with it. He just wants to kill, and they need to get to that a little bit, but they don't.
Oh my god! That's the best thing. No one has ever said that. The Infinity Gauntlet has been around for. Well, granted, it's different now because of the motivation, but.
Yeah,
wow!
He can do whatever he wants, and they need to start thinking about anyway.
That's amazing.
It's like, oh no, people are starving. Just make food. You can make food for everyone.
Yeah,
just
double the number of planets. Like,
it's just like, oh no, Earth is now double the size. It has double the continents now. Explore. It's great. Gee, anyway. But all of Earth's mightiest heroes are in various locations, and the movie does a really great job of kind of separating out small, very varied groups of different heroes, kind of remixing them all to fight, first of all, Thanos' acolytes, and then Thanos himself. Mm-hmm. While Thanos is on this mad quest. 3 times in the film, someone is held hostage in exchange for an Infinity Stone.
Yeah, give me the Infinity Stone or I'll kill this person. Yeah. Like, that's a thing.
That happens 3 times.
Yeah. And there's this thing, it's this thing we see in a lot of movies, and it's not just Marvel movies, like all action movies, where it's just like, if you don't give me the thing that will let me kill everybody, I'll kill just this one person. It's like, well, and the hero's just like, well, yeah, that's moral. Wait a minute, this is complicated.
Yeah, it's like,
this is really weird.
I really care about, and one character, I'm not going to say who it was, does say, yeah, just kill him.
yeah. But at the same time, like, it's this sort of thing where it's like, oh, there's a line Captain America has in this where he says, we don't trade lives. Oh. And that's actually a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. I like that. Like, it's the sort of thing where it's just like, those should not be our only options.
Yeah.
I like that. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I do admire about this movie is that most of the characters aren't in the movie for much because they don't have enough time. Mm-hmm. I would be surprised if any of the Marvel superheroes has more than 20 minutes of screen time in this nearly 3-hour movie. Yeah. Total. Maybe Iron Man, but like not a lot. And yet, I think there's a lot of really efficient writing here in which everything is conveyed very quickly. People do have huge dramatic moments. There's a moment where just the weight of everything that happened in Infinity War and Thor Ragnarok just comes crashing down on Thor. That's a really great moment.
The most emotional moment in the movie is a curious scene between Thor and Rocket Raccoon, where they're just sort of talking about where they are in their lives at that point.
Yeah.
And Thor he had some pretty horrible things happen to him in the last movie, and Rocket Raccoon is a complete cynic. He doesn't really care about people, and his reaction is pretty golden to that tragic story.
Yeah.
It's a really great moment. For the most part, though, this film is just action, and it's really, really good action.
Yeah, very varied, a lot of big stakes.
I got a little exhausted. I think a lot of people might get exhausted because it is 2 hours and 40 minutes long, this movie.
And it's a roller coaster ride. They put you through a lot of big emotional peaks and valleys.
However, for maybe the first 100 minutes or so, even though it's like pretty solidly action, it's really well choreographed. It's just good, efficient Hollywood action storytelling. Mm-hmm. And the characters all interact in a really interesting way. They're introduced very gracefully in a way that's never jarring.
Yeah, no one's ever introduced for no fucking reason. Even the characters who show up who you're surprised show up. There's always like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
The way these characters are introduced is really old hat for comic books. This is kind of a storytelling trope that comics perfected decades ago, and now it's just being used in a feature film way. in a really graceful fashion. You compare this to something like Justice League, if I may. A lot of those characters, the introductions were very jarring. It's like all of a sudden we're being introduced to Aquaman,
and we have
no
to
rhyme,
stop
no reason.
the movie to introduce Aquaman
Exactly.
and give him a whole bit. Here, we know all these characters that have already been introduced, so you can just have a thing where someone sees something on the news and then joins in the fight.
Yeah.
And that makes it feel really natural. I like the way this movie... I have this huge event fatigue, not with Marvel movies, but with Marvel crossover events. It's one of the reasons why I don't read comics the way I used to, is because every year there's going to be another giant crossover and there's no status quo to break.
Exactly.
So I just realized nothing means anything and I don't have to read your comics anymore, and I don't. Joe Quesada told me to vote with my money, so I did. Take that, Joe.
But what about Avengers versus X-Men?
Done. Didn't care. I was out. I was out by Secret Invasion. Secret Invasion was the last one. It was the last straw for me.
They redid Secret Wars, didn't they?
Like, they did a Secret War in a different way.
Secret Wars was the first big all Marvel crossover event, if I recall, which was like early 80s, I think that was.
I think so, yeah. It was a cool, but like...
And yeah, essentially, what Secret Wars did was rip all of the characters out of like regular reality, put them on a battlefield, and just had them all fight, so there were no consequences. You could just sort of watch them all fight.
There were a few lingering consequences. That's where we got Venom from.
A few.
A few. But like mostly it was just for funsies. But Infinity Gauntlet was a big deal. It had huge consequences. And I'm talking about in the comics. And it was really well put together. Like, you could read it today, and like maybe it's a little naive, some of the storytelling compared to some of the nuanced comic book storytelling that has evolved ever since. Like, it's constantly growing as a medium. But it works really, really well, and it finds a way to just sort of incorporate all these characters in a way that feels really natural. So this really did feel like watching an old school Marvel crossover event where everything is pretty well balanced. Every hero gets a moment. There's a big surprise every turn of the page. There's things happen you didn't expect to happen. Things happen in a way you didn't expect to happen. You go to places you never thought you'd see. There's a character who pops up in a way you never thought they'd pop up, or an actor who does.
Or two characters end up interacting two characters you never thought would interact start interacting.
Yeah, and that's really satisfying. And I really got to say, it is impressive how well they managed to take all of these moving parts and find a movie that is satisfying.
And feels like an actual movie.
Feels like an actual movie, but doesn't feel like a formulaic movie. They had to sort of reinvent the franchise a bit in order to tell this version of events this way, and I can only imagine how difficult it was to edit this thing.
Golly, yes.
You listen to the commentary track for even just the original Avengers, and then they talk about, like, this scene with Iron Man, like, doing this thing, and it segues perfectly from this other scene. We found that in the editing room. All of these scenes at the beginning were in a completely different order, and that happens. And a movie this complicated, you could take this scene with Thor and Rocket Raccoon and this scene with Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, and you could flip them around, and it would make just as much sense, but it would totally change the pacing of everything.
Yeah. So
the fact that it works as well as it does is kind of a miracle. That said, I have some critiques, and in order to do that, we're going to talk about some spoilers.
Okay, so pre-spoiler judgment. Good, efficient storytelling. I'm not going to call it great cinema, but it is an impressive feat, and I enjoyed a good portion of it, even though I did sort of wear out after a while. Now, we can get into spoilers, though, because there's some daring choices that I think I have some issue with.
I want to make a few comments as well before we get into spoilers. I think this is very bold, what they did. I think the way that they accomplished it is very impressive. I'm very high on this movie. I think it needs to be seen. I think it needs to be seen with knowing as little as possible while you still can, because it's going to have a bigger impact that way. And I think it's the kind of movie where I think we're really only going to appreciate how big and unusual it is as time goes on. I think it's going to be as we revisit this movie and pick away at it that we realize whether or not it works or whether or not it was just so surprising.
Yeah.
Either way, it needs to be seen. It's very impressive. I'm a big fan. I think it's great. Okay. Now, we're going to do spoilers, big spoilers, in 10, 9, 8, 7, not too late to change it, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay.
So, a lot of people do die in this movie. That's been advertised, or at least it's been leaked.
And it's been expected.
And it's been expected that people are going to die.
And if you read the original Infinity Gauntlet, half the universe died there. Guess what? Not that much of a surprise.
Not that much of a surprise. Happens here. Half of the universe dies. We get to watch heroes melt away. And and a few heroes even die along the way. I kind of appreciate when they murdered off the characters because it seems sort of brazen. This is a series that has been very slavishly devoted to status quo.
It's been very safe for the most part.
Despite all of these big sort of weird settings and different types, and wizards and space raccoons and all the rest, they do contain sort of tonal similarities because they all do need to fit together eventually. And in fact, announcing in advance what films you can expect over the course of the next 5 years or so kind of takes the fangs out of a lot of the consequences of a lot of these movies. We introduce these characters, we know they're going to show up later. And in fact, the one central kind of, I want to call it the joke, like the central punchline, the one single unifying factor that the series has always had is its interconnectivity.
Yes. That's what made it unlike anything else, really.
Yeah. And, well, other films did that, but they did it as they went, whereas this really had sort of the overarching universe in mind, which is previously something only TV shows did.
Yeah.
Now films are doing it as well. That can be exciting because you get to see these characters again, and you're eventually going to see them interact, which is what people are excited to see Infinity War about. However, because there is status quo, we know they can't change too much, which is why I always appreciate when something seems kind of daring, like when they kill off a character.
And there are certain characters who die, and their death has meaning.
And their death has a little bit of meaning.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you've been announcing for the last 5 years that there are films coming, and that there's going to be sequels, it takes the edge off a lot of it, and especially when you have this gigantic MacGuffin that is announced repeatedly can undo anything.
And that's a problem. No, it's a serious problem.
That is a problem.
I think it's a serious problem. I think it is. I think when you're watching the movie, and this is why I think it's going to really take multiple viewings to appreciate whether or not it's truly great. When you're watching the movie, just the fact that they go there and that they kill so many people and the villain wins.
Yeah.
I told you there were spoilers. The fact that they go there really is surprising, and it really takes you back just because you haven't seen a superhero movie do that. But then the second time you watch it, especially after the next one comes out, and I'm sorry, they're doing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3.
Yeah, we already know that
the next Spider-Man movie has been announced, so we know they're coming back in some way. And it lessens the blow, and it really keeps it from feeling like a gut punch, and more just like, what an interesting way to end the movie. I look forward to seeing how they're going to get out of it. You can look at it from the perspective of the characters, and the characters don't know they're in a movie. The characters don't know there's any safety at all, and I'm sure that not every character who has passed away will come back. I can't imagine them, it would be so dissatisfying if the next movie someone gets the Infinity Gauntlet and undoes everything, and everyone who ever died is alive again. And
you know what? That's what happens in the comics.
but I mean literally everyone who ever died ever. In the comics, they didn't bring back Bucky. Yeah, he came back eventually, but you know what I mean? They didn't use that opportunity to bring back Uncle Ben.
Well, what they did in the comics is Nebula is in the comics as well, but in the comics she's like a zombie.
Yeah.
She's just this skeleton with a little bit of flesh on it, and when Thanos is distracted at one point because he's merged with the universe and kind of become he's essentially become God. And his body is distracted. Nebula grabs it and says, I have the Infinity Gauntlet now. I can do whatever I want. The last 24 hours didn't happen. And she essentially just resurrects everybody.
And that's not dramatically satisfying. It makes sense, but it's not dramatically satisfying. It's the same reason why Thanos has all these Infinity Stones that even before he's omnipotent, basically allow him to do anything, he can change reality.
Yes, a reality stone.
Already, you're basically omnipotent. It's the fact that anyone can put up any sort of fight against him is already straining credulity. So, I accept that as sort of being dramatically exciting and also being a foregone conclusion at the same time. Yeah. I think that's a fair critique. For me, the thing I kept getting really distracted by was actually the beginning of the movie, first scene.
Okay.
The movie opens because at the end of Thor Ragnarok, Thor becomes the leader of his people, finally accepts his responsibility, comes close to his brother, and he's got his new friends Valkyrie and Korg and all of the surviving Asgardians, and they're on a ship and they're going to find a new home, and it was all leading up to this. Thor Ragnarok really led to a satisfying conclusion. Next scene, everyone but Thor and Hulk is dead.
like we saw they died before the movie opened.
Yeah, like there's a
in the
couple
scene
people
before the movie opened.
There's a couple people who die in that scene, but for the most part, everyone died off camera. And I'm like, this is some Alien 3 shit. Like, 'cause we never. Here's the thing. You know who's conspicuously absent from this movie? Valkyrie and Korg. They were big breakout characters, especially Valkyrie. And if she died off camera between movies, I am pissed because they never mention her again. That pisses me off, actually. And that actually, what bothers me about it is, it's not just like, oh, Infinity War is so great. Yeah, but it retroactively hurts Thor Ragnarok, which was a really good movie. And that kind of bugs me.
Well,
I thought that was completely unnecessary.
And
they could have had a line of dialogue explaining it or something, and they really don't.
That goes back to kind of a big problem I have with this notion of status quo. This is such a big moving machine that they're not permitted to do anything really extreme with the characters. When I watched the first Avengers film, I left angry because I felt it was a missed opportunity.
Only you.
I know I was the only one. It's fine. I can be the asshole. It's okay. But I was kind of mad that they spent they made the first Iron Man in 2008. Avengers came out in 2012. They had this big 4-year period where they kind of built it up. Now, really, the plan only included Thor and Captain America. The other two films were kind of already in place. And Disney kind of retconned them a little bit. But there were 4 films leading up to the Avengers. Yeah. And I felt like if you're going to bother taking these characters and giving them a picture apiece and then putting them into this big crossover event, make some sort of comment on their fundamental nature. Like, what does it mean that we need these characters now? What is it commenting on the real world? What does it mean that Captain America is alive in 2012? How does he react to the world? And they've been so keen on getting to, like, aliens invading and infinity stones and these big sort of fight scenes that seem to take place so divorced from reality that essentially all we're really seeing is superheroes doing superhero stuff. And a lot of people have been aching for that because superhero films haven't had a lot of that up to this point. There has always been some sort of fundamental change going in. Look at the X-Men, for instance. Okay. It deals with the core idea, but they're changing the attitude, they're changing the aesthetic. The characters are all being altered and moved around in big ways. And I think Bryan Singer, when he's making the X-Men films, is making some sort of comment. He's talking about outsider status. He's really kind of leaning into, especially with X-Men 2, coming out as gay. There's a coming out scene in X-Men 2.
Yeah,
there's like some thematic corollaries. I feel like when you get to something like Avengers, the only real theme is teamwork. Working together, which is something we've been hearing since first grade. You know, this is not a deep or fascinating film, and I feel like the filmmakers aren't really bothering to delve into what the characters are really about. They're just presenting them as they have already been for decades.
But I think that's one where they kind of just wanted to do one where we just had fun, and then we moved on. And then from there, we moved on to movies that at least tried to tackle some serious issues, like Winter Soldier.
I think Iron Man 3 is a great film about kind of closing the door on a superhero, but then, of course, he's just sort of back in the next one.
Yeah.
And yeah, some of the films have been trying to sort of elbow their way out of that status quo. I think Iron Man 3, Captain America, The Winter Soldier to a degree.
Civil War, I think, as well, tries to handle it. It's a bit clunky, but there are things that work in it.
I think that one's a little ungainly.
I think Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a very strange film about family.
Yeah.
And I think I can appreciate that.
I feel like the last few have been a little bit more iconoclastic. Black Panther especially. That's just a film unto itself.
Yeah.
That has no strain against the status quo, and that's what makes it so great.
Yeah.
And I feel like even as we get to something as broadly complex as Infinity War, where all of these characters are now together, they're still offering us that same thing. Superheroes doing superhero stuff. The stakes are much higher.
Yeah.
People are dying, but we're still not getting some sort of fundamental comment as to why we need this universe to be this complex. It's way too story-oriented to be any kind of have any sort of like thematic heft.
You want it to be thematically oriented.
Exactly,
you want there to be a reason for this movie to exist other than its own existence.
And there is a way to do this story, and it's to make the movie specifically about Thanos.
And I think they try. Like,
and they try, but
arc,
consider
but
if they had called the film The Thanos Story or The Thanos Quest, or just Thanos Part 1, it would have made, and we saw him as a young boy, and we saw his world falling apart, and we came to understand exactly why he needed to do this thing.
Yeah.
And the heroes were the villains in the story. That would have been fascinating because now we have to deal with his philosophy a little bit more directly, rather than him effectively being just a bad guy with a super weapon. functionally a bad guy.
No, you're not wrong. I think Thanos is actually one of the more interesting Marvel villains that we've had, at least in the movies.
He's performed great.
I think Josh Brolin really. I mean, yeah, it's a CGI creation, but I buy him so much more than many of the other CGI created villains we've had. You know, Steppenwolf, which is just that was just a plot, pure character. Thanos at least has a rationale, and there's some really good flashback scenes with him and Gamora. And there's like a bit where they're talking about like Mantis is like on his head and like reading his emotions. He's like, but no, he's really mourning.
Yeah,
he's actually got feelings. Like it's actually like worth exploring that. And I thought that was really, really great. But yeah, you're right. The stakes are higher. It is bigger, but it does feel like, once again, we're kind of only doing this because bad guy wants to destroy the universe, and there really isn't anything super connected to it. And it's a shame because I honestly think that level of interconnectedness could have been the theme. I think it could have been just like everyone from different corners of the universe, different experiences, or all come together for the common good, or we all come together in a crisis. And that's the sort of thing that we, have come to explore in real life.
There's so little time to talk, though, that the characters don't really get those moments where it's like, well, here's my motivation. Hey, it turns out everybody shares some sort of common thread here. There's a way to gracefully weave that in, and I don't think they really do it that well. But that being
said, I think this might be the sort of situation where it's so strange and so unusual and so many moving parts, and so much of this movie had to be sort of engineered in a very unique way that the fact that it came this good, even with like critiques of here's how it could have been legendary beyond the sheer fact of its existence, it's still like praising with faint damnation. I think.
I cannot lambast any of the technicals or any of the structure. I think that, all of the way the fights come together, the way the characters interact, all of that is impeccable. It's when you start peeling away the layers that you realize there's not much underneath.
Well, and again, it's like I keep talking about the idea of text, subtext, which there's relatively little subtext, but and function, which is, the movie does exist and it does have to do certain things, and one of the things it has to do is work within a franchise, and the franchise itself will continue, and we know that, and that function actually hurts the actual content of the movie. I'm also really bummed with the post-credit sequence. I like teasing. I like teasing Captain. Okay, again, spoilers. Everyone knows. I like teasing Captain Marvel. That's great. I'm excited for Captain Marvel. I can't wait for Captain Marvel.
I hope it has a really great '90s soundtrack.
Me too. Here's the deal: half the universe just died, and your post-credit scene is Nick Fury paging someone.
Yeah, like
that's the post. I thought we were gonna
somehow this is going to fix everything.
Yeah, I thought the post-credit sequence was gonna be like, all those like heroes who are just like, oh my god, all our friends just disappeared. I wanted to see like maybe like another reality in which all the heroes who just suddenly disappeared, like Spider-Man and Black Panther, in which they go, oh my god, all our friends disappeared. They're the half who died, and it turns out Thanos just shunted them into another reality, and he wasn't that evil in the first place.
Some weird twist like
or
that.
They're all stuck in the Soul Stone, or all of a sudden the Fantastic Four like come out of a spaceship and go, hey, what'd we miss? Like something huge. That's your coda, is paging someone?
And again, it's just an ad for the next one, isn't it?
And it's so weak. And
it's weak because
the Captain Marvel, but the actual scene sucks.
Yeah, the final scenes of this movie is just like heroes blinking out of existence. They're just melting away. They're dying. And we see that happen in the post-credit sequence as well. People are just melting away. And it's this supposedly a very emotional moment where you're sort of watching characters you love vanish, and they punctuate it with a commercial.
I know.
It's like Cummings and,
And I gotta tell you something. Again, we don't know what's going to happen in Captain Marvel. We know what takes place in the 90s, but we don't know, like, where she's been this whole time. But if he's calling Captain Marvel, here's my thing. Means she's alive. Means there's a 50-50 chance she died, too. He doesn't know. Anything could have fucking happened.
But again, it seems so cheap to do that at the end of this one.
And again, I'm excited for Captain Marvel. Tease Captain Marvel. Find a better way to do it than that, because that's really not great.
Here's the teaser. Here's the character teaser. You should have done at the end of Infinity War. Thanos is sitting on a farm, drinking tea. His life is peaceful. He's accomplished what he wants to. He's got nothing else to do. He can spend the rest of his life just relaxing and farming. Worrying about those resources that he could have made himself, but whatever. Yeah. We see some feet enter the frame, and we hear, so, kind of a nihilist, ain't you? And we look up, and it's Adam Warlock.
I know, you were so excited for Adam Warlock.
I wanted to see Adam Warlock.
I know, we all want to see Adam Warlock.
And the post-credit sequence is a 90-minute film where they just talk about nihilism. That's the movie I want to see.
God. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. We're going to have to keep exploring this movie and its various nuances over time.
I think by the end of the year, we'll see how we still feel about it. I think after, after the next chapter, Ant-Man and the Wasp, after we watch Ant-Man, we'll see how we feel about Infinity War.
Yeah, because these things, the new films affect the old films.
Yeah, and they all feed off of each other.
Yeah, which is my concern with Thor Ragnarok. I feel like I got neutralized. But anyway, moving on. Spoilers over. I'll put a time code in the podcast so you know. Real fast, what is your review score on a scale of C- to C+? C- being bad, C+ being great, C in the middle, for the week of?
Week of is a C-.
That's too bad. What about Infinity War?
Infinity War, it's right on the cusp between a C and a C+. It is so technically impressive and so enjoyable that it's hard to give just a C.
I'm definitely giving it a C+.
But yeah, I can't. I have a lot of things I want to think
I think
about.
Whatever critiques I may have, this is definitely a movie you need to see. And I think the things it does so ridiculously well. They need to be experienced. So that's that. Now, for next week, we're not going to do any letters because we don't want people who left because they didn't want Infinity War spoilers to miss them in case we read their letters. So we'll do more letters next week.
Plus, I got to go.
He's got to go.
I'm on the clock here.
real fast. Okay, next week, we're going to be back with reviews of Overboard, Bad Samaritan, and Tully. We're also going to be back to our usual thing where you vote for a bad movie for us to review over on the Schmoville Facebook page. Go to Schmoville !! On Facebook, sign up for that group, and you can vote for the bad movies. Your choices this week, and we're going to only have 3 nominees from now on because we used to have 5 and the 4th and 5th never came close. So I figure this way everyone's vote will matter more. So we're going to bring in the blockbuster season, a whole bunch of blockbuster bombs, famous, notorious blockbuster bombs. And your choices are, yes, Sergio, I know, thank you. Cat's meowing in the background. Your choices are the legendary bomb pirate epic Cutthroat Island.
Which lost a lot of money. People don't talk about that one.
A catastrophic amount of money. We're gonna, or if you don't want that, you can pick the enormously unsuccessful Bruce Willis heist comedy Hudson Hawk. Or we can talk about the enormously unsuccessful Dustin Hoffman, Warren Beatty comedy Ishtar.
I haven't seen Ishtar.
I've never seen Ishtar either. It's one of those movies everyone talks about, no one actually watches. Let's find out what they vote for, and we will pair it up with a good movie or a
thematically linked classic of some sort.
And we will pair that up next week in addition to all those other reviews. So everybody, thank you very, very much for listening. If you want to email us, we're at criticallyacclaimedfans@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook at William Bibbiani.
I'm at Witney Seibold.
If you want more Francis Ford Coppola stuff, head on over to our other podcast, Canceled Too Soon. This week we are reviewing his strange failed sci-fi pilot for a TV series called White Dwarf, in which Neil McDonough from Legends of Tomorrow screams at an ocean of blood, plays a sad game of tetherball, befriends a shapeshifter, falls in love with an immortal princess, and that's not the weird stuff.
Don't forget the fish monster.
I almost forgot the fish monster. Anyway, that's all for us. Thank you very, very much for listening, and never forget, everyone's a critic.
I want to go to the midnight show. I'm sorry, what?